Hi, this is Kevin Young, and I lead the technical production of the Baker Briefing podcast. On behalf of all of us at the Baker Institute, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for listening. In the past year, we've published over 30 episodes on critical topics such as youth mental health crisis, oil production, maternal mortality, and even data security. Producing timely commentary on important topics is core to our mission at the Baker Institute. As we head into 2024, our production calendar is filling up with some excellent topics. We hope you'll follow along as we dig into the U.S. presidential race, international relations, human rights issues, city planning, and much, much more. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. To receive notice of new podcasts, sign up to receive Baker Institute emails at bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for listening, and now, our first episode of 2024.
From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I am Ed Emmett and host today. Today's topic, fascinating, the City of Houston's budget. Question to ask is the city in good financial shape for the future? Is Houston facing a bleak future? Earlier this year, the Greater Houston Partnership formed a City of Houston Budget Task Force, and they enlisted Professor John Diamond of Rice University to help lead the research and compile a report detailing the long-term health of Houston's finances. Some say their findings were a bit dire. Professor Diamond and his colleagues showed that from 2017 to 2023, Houston's recurring expenditures have exceeded its recurring revenues by between $100 and $200 million every year. These gaps have been filled by one-time revenue sources, the delay of major maintenance projects into future years, and deferred expenses. Most recently, the use of one-time federal stimulus dollars. This practice is not sustainable. To help explain how we got here and what to do about it in the future is Dr. John Diamond. John, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the basic. The average resident of Houston understands that the city of Houston has to have a balanced budget. So they go, okay, it's been balanced every year. But your report focuses on some revenue sources that can't be relied on in the future. So let's start with the revenue side. What are the revenue sources for the city of Houston, and what are the problems that they're going to be facing?
So Houston has several revenue sources, but obviously they raise a lot of revenues through property taxes and sales taxes. They also get revenues from the federal government. They get grants and other investment monies from the federal government. The problem is the comparison between expenditures and revenues. And this is really a long-term problem that was actually created a long time ago. You know, Houston's budget was in great shape in the late 1990s. Actually, our pension systems were fully funded, if not overfunded. Some of the pension systems were funded at 110%, which should actually happen in a healthy system. You should go from overfunded, maybe to slightly underfunded, and just kind of bounce around that number. But there was a huge pension increase in the early 2000s, and it was completely unsustainable. Ever since then, we've been struggling with very large pension costs that run about 30% of employee pay, which is far too much for an employee pension cost, and that's just the pension cost. If you add on health benefits or other post-employment benefits, the cost of employee pensions and other post-employment benefits run about almost 40% of an employee's pay. And that's just too expensive. And it's all legacy liability that we owe to workers that benefited from this pension expansion in the early 2000s. And so ever since then, there's been multiple pension reforms culminating in the 2017 reform under Mayor Turner's leadership. And most of the prior pension reforms were just give and take. So take money out of one pocket and put it in the other. Really did very little to change the system, although along the way, each time future employees had their pensions cut because they're not at the table, and current employees managed to maintain most of their benefits. And so it's led to this system now where we owe constitutionally these pension benefits, which cannot be cut Once they're promised, they're law and you're going to pay them. And we've whittled down future employee benefits so that now pension plus health plus Social Security is probably running in the 15 to 20% range, which is pretty reasonable. So there's not a lot we can do there, but we still suffer from very large annual cost of funding all of the prior pension benefits. And so that's what sets up the story. So now we get to today, we get to 2017 when there was a major reform of the pension system, which was a great reform. It actually put us in position to manage a large and very hefty pension expense that's going to put a strain on the city's budget for at least the next 3 decades. So that is where the whole story starts. So we get to COVID and we get $1.5 trillion from the federal government. And the question is what did we do with it? And we did some good with it, but we didn't do nearly the good we could have done. We could have used it to invest in our infrastructure, to help solve the pension problem, which is far from solved, whereas Mayor Turner deserves great credit for implementing the 2017 reform and putting the city in a position to manage a hefty pension cost. We're not out of the woods and the problem has not been solved, and it's going to continue to have economic consequences for the next 3 decades.
Okay, but to the average person who lives in the city of Houston, they hear about pension and they heard that it got solved in 2017 and now we're in the midst of a recent election, and whether it's been solved or not remains. But, you know, they want their streets fixed. They want more police on the streets. How does all this impact the other services? There's been a lot of controversy lately about the ability of the city of Houston to supply water and the cost of that. You focused a lot on the pension, but it's these other things that affect people's daily lives. How are they going to be impacted? And while we're at it, let's go back to the revenue side too, because the city of Houston is, some people say, hamstrung a little bit in terms of revenue cap that they have. How do they raise the money to meet the pension cost and provide these other necessary services?
Well, and so that's where the report takes what I really examined. So I set out the major problem facing the city, which is very large annual contributions to the pension. It's easy. If you just cut those in half, make employee pensions 20% of pay, and you take the other 20%, so $200 billion a year, well, we could do a lot of good. We could invest in a lot of infrastructure, water, roads, wastewater. A lot could be done. But what's happened instead is because the pension costs are so unaffordable, you have to find a place in the budget to pay for that money. So what the city has been doing, and why the streets are so bad, why the water system, the wastewater system is in shambles, the freshwater system is extremely inefficient, losing 20 to 30 million gallons per day, and our water plants are in dire need of being completely reconstructed. 50% of the East Houston water purification plant needs to be reconstructed. These problems have arisen after years of deferring maintenance to solve current budget problems. And I would like to lay this out in a super simple way, but unfortunately, reading city documents and figuring out how the money is spent and where it's directed is very difficult. And so the best thing I can say is that for the last 20 years, we've used the money that should be used to invest in water, roads, drainage, and other things to prop up a very expensive pension system. The 2017 reform helps us start to get this under control, but we're nowhere near having it completely under control. I lay out in the paper all of the risk facing the city. Now, is it dire? It's not dire. It's not like tomorrow we're going to fall off the map. It's more of just a word of caution. If you continue down this road, it will become dire. In fact, the city residents will face some hard times. They won't have many services. Their services will be decrepit, kind of like we're seeing now. Water leakages, having the water boil notification this last summer. We have a lot of problems. The roads. City residents are noticing these things because it's taken the course of 20 years for them to be apparent. Depreciation doesn't happen overnight. It's a year-by-year occurrence. The real point of the paper is not that we need to change everything right now. or that we're in dire straits right now. It's that we need to step back. We need to recognize the lack of investment in our infrastructure over the last 20 years and the deficits we now face. We're at odds with the EPA and have a consent decree on the wastewater system that requires Houston to spend an additional $2 billion over 15 years to get the wastewater system to a state where we're not contaminating the groundwater. That's an expense. The city's going to have to find a way to pay for that. I've mentioned that in the freshwater system, we're losing 20 to 30 million gallons per day. That's unacceptable. I don't know the cost of repairing the delivery of fresh water, but it's at least going to be on level with the cost of repairing the wastewater system. We need to replace plants 1 and 2 at the East Houston Water Purification Plant. There's a study out on that. That's going to cost about $1.5 billion. And our roadways have been underinvested in for the better part of the last 20 years. And I estimate that to get the roadways up to where they were in 2005 would cost about $3.7 billion. So all of these investments need to be made. Do they need to be made today? No, you can't make that kind of investment today. Each year we need to start putting more and more money into our infrastructure. That's the problem facing the city. And yes, this then ties into the revenue problem, which we say revenue problem. Let's be clear, revenues have been growing rapidly for the city over the last 2 decades. It hasn't been a case that revenues have been declining. Revenues have been growing by at least population plus inflation growth. But that's probably not going to be enough looking into the future. At the same time, expenditures have been growing rapidly. So the gist of the paper is we need to get our expenditures under control. We need to make sure that every dollar being spent is worth it. And we need to really start shifting them towards long-term goals of infrastructure improvement, water, roads, as well as in current things such as crime.
So of the money that comes into the city, do you have a clear indication percentage that's sales tax versus property tax versus federal dollars and grants and things?
It's almost all sales and property tax. Of the money coming in, the city is basically funded largely by sales, property, and some fees. That's not an inconsequential amount. But sales and property are roughly the 2 biggest funding sources.
And the city of Houston has actually been losing population lately in the last few years. The pandemic clearly hurt office space, so people aren't going downtown anymore. Did your research indicate anything about the future of sales tax revenue? Is it likely to go up significantly, stay flat, go down?
So I talked about all of the risks and some potential solutions. So the city puts out its own estimates over a 5-year period. So looking forward 5 years. So this year they would put out a forecast from 2023 to 2028. The mayor's office projected that we were going to have a budget shortfall between $100 and $300 million, depending on whether they use their optimistic or pessimistic forecast. And the controller put out a more pessimistic forecast that we were going to have a shortfall between $400 and $600 million in 2028, with shortfalls in every year from now until 2028, if you don't account for federal dollars. So one of the sections of the paper just looked at, okay, well, this is their estimates. Well, what's going on currently with sales tax revenues? Currently, sales tax revenues are extremely high. In fact, they're higher than they've ever been. And if you look historically at the share of the consumer's consumption as a share of GDP, it's gone up a considerable amount above its historical average. Why would it have gone up above the average amount? Well, 2 reasons. The first was all of the government stimulus in post-COVID. And so consumers were flush with savings and they've had deep pockets and they've been spending more than they spent if you look back over the last 20 years as a share of GDP. Second, in 2022, we had very high levels of inflation, which are also going to drive consumption expenditures up. We can expect that 2022 inflation will kind of be permanent as prices are permanently higher. But the 2021 increase driven by government fiscal stimulus, that's probably not going to be a permanent change. And consumer purchases will fall back to their historical level and we will go on from there. The problem with that is current city budgets have really high levels of sales tax revenues because consumers are spending a lot of money because they received a lot of money and they have large piles of savings post-COVID. Now what we've seen is all of that's diminished. Now consumers are starting to take on more debt. They've exhausted their excess savings and in fact have drawn savings down to a deficit. The federal government is beginning to slow down its fiscal stimulus. So you're going to see the consumer pull back. Now, everybody's been predicting that that pullback was going to occur at the end of this year, and everybody was wrong, as usual. But what's never wrong is the economy does flow in cycles, and we are definitely near a peak. We're either at the peak, just before the peak, or just after the peak. And we're going to return to an economy that's more normal, and we will hit a downturn. And so the point in the paper was, if you're using peak numbers and you're still running a $100 million deficit, then you have a problem, because we know we're not going to stay at the peak. And so sales tax revenues will almost certainly be returning to a more normal level. And I would say that's going to be about a 5 to 10% decrease in revenues sometime over the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay. Well, since we started with the word dire, you said it is not really that dire. People remember when New York City went completely bankrupt and had to be bailed out. We've got a new administration coming in the city of Houston. They're well aware. What kind of final word would you say to the people in Houston and those credit agencies and everybody outside of Houston? What's the future of Houston in your mind? What does your paper really conclude?
You know, the future of Houston depends on the decisions of the leaders of Houston. If you invest in the city, if you keep crime rates low, if you have good streets, good water delivery, good drainage, you invest in that infrastructure appropriately and you don't underinvest in it as we've been doing the last 2 decades. So if we get back into a model of investing in our city, Houston's going to thrive. And that's really, I never said Houston was in a dire, it's at a tipping point. So we're going to either go up or down. If we continue to underinvest in our infrastructure, we'll be the next Detroit. If we invest in our infrastructure, Houston could be a great city, one of the best cities in the U.S., and it'll be a city that attracts more and more people. Currently, we're not attracting more people. And that's because areas around us have more infrastructure, more amenities to offer. Houston needs to catch up. We need to get our financial house in order. We need to be fiscally responsible, and we need to invest in our infrastructure while not socking it to the taxpayers so much that they can find a better deal somewhere else. Taxpayers always weigh tax versus city services combination when they're choosing somewhere to live. Houston needs to offer a competitive tax and very nice amenities. You only do that if you practice fiscal responsibility and good governance.
And sometimes it's much easier said than done.
It's a lot easier said than done.
But it is a hopeful note. So, John, I appreciate you being with us this morning.
Absolutely.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. The production lead for this episode was Grayson Bobian. To learn more, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. And thank you for listening.